Hello, everyone. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service. It's wonderful to be able to come together with alumni from all over the world. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're kind of calling in from. We are here with the first of our SFS Fast Break series in response to global events that are dominating the headlines and bringing our best faculty members to you to give you their fast break analysis of what's happening and what will happen. And also, we'll leave some time for questions. This is meant to be a 30-minute lunchtime for those who are on the East Coast break. So it's really meant to be quick analysis, and we will try to sort of stick to the time and respect your time. But I'm very, very pleased to start off with one of our finest professors here at the School of Foreign Service. For those of you who've engaged with him already, you know what I'm talking about. It's Professor Dan Byman, a professor here at SFS, the government department, but director of our security studies program. And on this topic in particular, really one of the most sort of sought after experts. He wrote the book, literally, on Israeli counterterrorism experts. He wrote a book called A High Price, Triumphs and Failures of Israeli Counterterrorism. He's got a couple of pieces that have come out just this week in Foreign Policy magazine. He's been on the airwaves, whether it's on NPR with the Fresh Air, PBS, and so many CNN, so many other engagement. So it's great to have Dan here. He is the right person to be talking about this incredibly intricate, complex, and at the moment, very worrying set of changes going on across the Middle East. So Dan, it's great to have you here. Thank you. And I'm going to sort of start really just to ask you kind of, level set us for a moment. The current situation in southern Lebanon, the incursion into at the southern border, the extraordinary intelligence operations with the pagers, the assassination of Nasrallah. This has been a remarkable sort of change and an escalation in what was already a remarkable situation in the Middle East in the Gaza war. And then, of course, Iran's missile attack and the threat of response has also fundamentally changed the dynamics. Where do we sort of sit now? How would you evaluate the situation now? We'll talk about where we think it's going in the future.
So, first of all, thank you everyone for joining us, and it's really a pleasure to be here with Dean Hellman. The situation, as you can imagine, is extremely chaotic and uncertain. There are a lot of actors involved: Iran, the United States, Hezbollah, Hamas, and each one has considerable agency on this. Things can really go in different directions. But what we've seen in the last month is a shift in the center of this war from Gaza to Lebanon. And for Israelis, much of the Israeli security establishment had been focused on Hezbollah and Iran really for decades. And they saw these as the primary threats to Israel. And there was a real question for Israel after the October 7th attacks, which is, do we begin in Gaza or do we begin in Lebanon? And Israel almost attacked Lebanon with a massive strike on Hezbollah on October 8th. And so the fact that it's come almost full circle to this is not terribly surprising, in part because Hezbollah is a much stronger foe than Hamas, and Israel has felt that it really needs to hit the organization hard. But this creates new dilemmas for escalation. Israel is still not out of Gaza. There's the possibility, even probability, of a greater Israel-Iran confrontation. And of course, there's fierce fighting going on right now in Lebanon. The one thing I would say about Lebanon, before going back to you, is that the fighting, so far at least, has gone about as well as I think Israel could realistically hope for. The pager operation, the walkie-talkie operation, disabled probably thousands of day-to-day Hezbollah fighters. There have been repeated strikes on leadership in addition to Nasrallah that have decimated the senior ranks. The airstrikes on Hezbollah have reportedly, it's very hard for me to verify, destroyed a lot of Hezbollah's capability to attack Israel with rockets and missiles. And the ground operations, so far at least, may be successful. That's a little more uncertain. But in all this, Hezbollah seems weak, off balance. And in addition to the losses of so many people, it also may not trust its own communications. And it's very difficult to do anything in the world today if you can't communicate effectively with large numbers of people. But Hezbollah can't trust its phones, it can't trust its radios, it can't trust its pagers. It worries about its leaders gathering in large groups because they might be killed. So it's hard for it to mount a coordinated response to Israel, even though it's feeling tremendous pressure at the same time.
So what do you think might be then the next steps in Lebanon? If, as you're sort of suggesting, this blow was very so significant to Hezbollah's capacity to mount a counter attack, and if you will, what do you think this means for the likelihood of a larger a ground combat between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and the extent to which Hezbollah will make a significant counter response?
So let me talk a little bit about how I see Israel's war goals. And I would say that there are a couple things motivating Israel. One is there has been a steady buildup in the last 15 years of Hezbollah's military capabilities. And part of this is a massive rocket and missile arsenal. The standard estimate we use is around 150,000 rockets and missiles, so really huge numbers. But very important is that Hezbollah, with Iran's help, has been building its precision munitions. And what that means is it has systems that can usually hit within 10 meters of a target unless they're intercepted. And this is a game changer. Israel's about the size of New Jersey. And you could shut down New Jersey with no disrespect to the state with a relatively small number of rockets and missiles. If you're hitting airports, if you're hitting train stations, if you're hitting political headquarters. And so Israel has been trying to intercept these weapons, destroy them. Many have gone through Syria, and there have been a lot of strikes there. So one of its goals is simply to degrade Hezbollah, and in particular, these systems. Another, though, is about 60,000 Israelis have been displaced from northern Israel. And when I was in Israel a few months back, people were constantly talking about the question of how to bring these people home. And I should mention that even before the latest round of fighting, around 100,000 Lebanese were displaced, and now the number is far greater. But Israelis were saying we need to do something, and this back and forth limited war isn't working. Right? That as long as Hezbollah can rain rockets down and is going to on a daily basis, people aren't going home. So Israel has, say, a broad goal of weakening Hezbollah and a shorter term goal of bringing its people home. So the military operation, in my view, is designed with these in mind. So goal number one is simply to push Hezbollah forces back away from the border. And one thing that is a nightmare for Israelis is some sort of repeat of October 7th. Hezbollah has long talked about doing operations in Israel. This isn't kind of a made-up Israeli concern. Hezbollah has talked about what it would call Operation Galilee, which is effectively in northern Israel, and doing ground operations like October 7th there. So the rhetorical backing for this is real. And Israel is worried that Hezbollah forces are along the border, and even though according to UN Resolution 1701, they're not supposed to be, but that they're there in a threat, so it's trying to push them away from the border, probably a little south of the Litani River in Lebanon. But the problem Israel faces is it's done that before, and Hezbollah just comes back. So how do you make sure the group doesn't come back? And there's no good answer, right? You could get more UN troops on the border, but that didn't work the last time. I think part of Israel's goal is to simply hit Hezbollah so hard that it really doesn't want to repeat this conflict. But to flip this now, Hezbollah historically is a very strong organization. It is dedicated. It fought Israel from 1982 to 2000 and pushed Israel over out of Lebanon. It was the only Arab force to defeat Israel militarily. In 2006, Hezbollah and Israel fought a war for 34 days, and Hezbollah was a draw, and Hezbollah on the last day is raining down rockets in Israel. So it's a very strong force. Again, it has Iranian help. And Hezbollah sees itself as defending Lebanon. It would say that it's the Israelis who are the attackers. It said it will not stop fighting as long as Israel is fighting Hamas. So it's really unclear what will make Hezbollah stop fighting. And I think part of Israel's hope is that by hitting Hezbollah hard enough, it will have no choice but to give in. But Hezbollah has shown very effectively throughout its entire history that it's a very determined organization. So the lesser, I think, more realistic hope may be that Israel simply pushes Hezbollah back a bit and weakens the organization.
So do you think then, at least on the short-term objectives, and I see the point that you're raising on the longer-term issue of Hezbollah and the strength of Hezbollah's organization, on both in the engagement with Hamas in Gaza and the engagement with Hezbollah on the southern border, do you think that Israel is closer to its short-term objectives of at least reducing the short-term risk that Hamas poses to Israel from Gaza and the short-term risk that Hezbollah poses, as you're saying, not only to those who are evacuated on the border, but as you say, given their position, the potential for precision munitions, their ability to have a larger scale attack on some major aspect of Israeli infrastructure?
So I'll start with Hezbollah and then go to Hamas. With Hezbollah, the answer is a very firm maybe. There's no question Hezbollah has been hit really hard, right? The leadership strikes have been devastating. The attacks on the rank and file with the Patriots have been devastating. The airstrikes have been devastating. But Hezbollah was very, very cautious in some ways and did not want to escalate further against Israel. I mentioned it had this massive arsenal. It wasn't using it. It was doing primarily attacks across the border. Rather than striking deep into Israel, it was only using a limited amount of its forces. So I can say today that Hezbollah's hurt. Maybe it's been pushed back, it's been weakened, but it's quite possible that tomorrow Hezbollah will be able to unleash a much more massive barrage on Israel and leave Israel worse off. So a lot depends on Hezbollah's willingness and capability to use this massive arsenal. And there, at least from the outside, there are genuine questions about how much it can do so, but it's certainly possible. It's certainly a real possibility. With Hamas, I would say Hamas has been devastated as an organization. It's lost much of its leadership in Gaza. It's lost much of its fighting force. Its ability to fight in an organized way is reduced. There's anger among many Gazans at Hamas as well as, of course, at Israel for the devastation of Gaza. I would note, however, that I would have said the same thing 6 months ago. I think the marginal gains of continued Israeli operations are extremely limited. And although Israel has reduced the danger of Hamas, it's effectively created a failed state in Gaza. And from the start, not only academics like me, but frankly, people who mattered, like senior U.S. military leaders and intelligence leaders, went to Israel and said, what the United States learned in Afghanistan, what the United States learned in Iraq was removing the government, killing the bad guys. That's the easy part. Right? The hard part is putting something solid in its place to make sure they don't come back. And Israel has refused to go down that road. So almost a year into this conflict, there's still a question of what's going to take Hamas's place in Gaza. And if there's no answer to that, the answer is actually Hamas. That Hamas will simply come back and Israel will be trapped in Gaza indefinitely. So to me, that's a tremendous failure of Israeli policy. And that is in addition, that's just on its own terms, in addition to the staggering suffering that we're seeing in Gaza on a day-to-day basis, not only from military operations, but from the humanitarian crisis there. So there's a question on, does Israel need to do something, yes or no, for military reasons? But in my view, that military role has, for a while now, ceased to be particularly effective in Gaza.
Well, one piece of the military role that we haven't discussed, and I see in the chat that Geyer is asking about it, is of course Iran, and the obviously now potential cusp that we are on in a changed relationship in the engagement with Iran in this crisis after the missile attack and the predicted Israeli response. Where do you see that going, and what is the likelihood of this three-front engagement or multi-front engagement, because you also have, of course, Syria, Yemen, the Houthis in Yemen, and Iraq as well. So just bring Iran into the picture here as what you see going next.
So Israel did a series of strikes on Iran that were humiliating for the regime, right? It killed the leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, not just in Iran, but really in the heart of the regime stronghold. The comparison I would make in the United States, for those of you who, well, all of you know Washington, you're Georgetown people, would be Blair House, right? Imagine if the Chinese did a military operation in Blair House, and what a extra humiliation that would be. Um, the killing of Nasrallah, who was personally close to Iran's supreme leader, as well as ideologically close and strategically close to Iran, was another humiliating blow. And Iran's proxy forces in Iraq and Yemen and elsewhere, they want to know Iran can hit back, that Iran's just not going to stand there when their people are killed. So Iran felt compelled to do a strong response. It used better weapons than its previous April response. These were largely ineffective. At least sitting here from Washington, I would say they were ineffective. But if you're in Israel, you see it differently, right? Some weapons got through. There was a big hole in, some parts of Herzliya and other parts of the country. And so you're not feeling very calm and saying, oh, that was great, right? You're worried that the next attack more will get through. They'll hit your kid's school or something like that. Last time Israel did a very, very limited strike in response to Iran's strike in a way that was designed to de-escalate. That was in April. This time around, I think Israel is going to do a much larger strike. The Biden administration apparently has been talking to them about oil infrastructure. My own bet is more on Iran's military infrastructure. But to be clear, there's just a lot of speculation. There's a lot that certainly I don't know, but I think we don't know. But the big question is then, does Iran respond to Israel's response, and do you get this cycle? And I think if Israel's response is effective but discreet, Iran would be happy to pull back. That doesn't mean, though, it will, right? It has fierce politics of its own, and backing down in the face of an Israeli attack will be costly. But at the very least, Iran is going to redouble support to various proxy forces. That Iran doesn't have that many strategic options, and working with these groups in Yemen or Iraq or elsewhere is one way of spreading influence. One thing people like me are worried about is, in the past, both Iran and Hezbollah have turned to international terrorism as a way of escalating when problems have occurred in their immediate theaters. So Iran and Hezbollah did attacks in Bulgaria, in Argentina, on Israeli and Jewish targets when they saw themselves facing losses in Iran or in the region. So that's, I think, definitely back on the table. I don't want to say it's definite, but it should be of considerable concern.
Now, in the chat, I'm getting messages or questions from Robert Chaikin, from Josiah Smith, from Michael Ferguson, all asking about the U.S. role. Now, obviously, the Biden administration sort of said very, very clearly what it wanted to avoid was a wider regional conflict, and where we are is what appears to be a wider regional conflict. How did the U.S. Not achieve the objectives it sought in dealing with the region? What role could the administration have played to prevent this? And given that this is all happening very close to an election, is this any way going to be really contingent or even impact, the election itself? A little bit on the U.S. role.
So one thing to remember from the start is, after October 7th, Israel saw this as an existential struggle, right? This wasn't kind of, business as usual, where there are, Israel's concerns and the U.S. has concerns, and you kind of sort these out. This was seen truly as life or death. And so it's hard for any country to influence another when it sees the stakes as existential. So I want to start with that, but then I want to go to your other point, which is the political situation in the United States is fraught. There is not kind of strong unity on these issues. There is going to be criticism of the president, regardless of which stance he takes. And doing all this as an election approaches is much harder. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is a very keen observer of U.S. politics, so he's certainly aware of the weak U.S. position. I would also note that the United States hasn't helped itself with the way it's tried to push Israel. So it said two things that are hard to go together. One is, we will stand by you, and we're there for you 100%. And if Iran attacks you, we're going to be very forceful about this. We're going to provide assistance. We are providing weapons. We are providing intelligence. We are helping coordinate air defenses. So very much openly in Israel's corner. And at the same time saying, but we want you to stop certain behavior. And it's perfectly reasonable, I think correct, for Israeli leaders to conclude that the United States isn't serious when it says stop, that the United States is going to stand by Israel no matter what. So therefore, okay, you can listen to the United States if you want, but if you feel it's not in your interest, whether that's strategic or political, you don't need to. It's not going to cost you much in your own country. And Netanyahu, who's an extremely skilled politician, has actually at times turned the United States into a punching bag politically. One area where there's genuine disagreement is over the role of the Palestinian Authority, the more moderate pro-Western Palestinian forces, and Netanyahu has opposed a role for the Palestinian Authority. And he's been portraying himself as standing up to the United States on this issue because that position has a lot of support within Israel. So I think all this does, however, pose some risks to the United States. One is, of course, Israel is unpopular. And so U.S. association with Israel hurts U.S. popularity. Another is a threat to U.S. forces, where Iranian proxies have at times attacked U.S. forces. U.S. has attacked back, and that's often hurt the proxies much more, but it's at least a risk. And there's also a U.S. credibility issue, where when the United States is saying to Israel, don't do this, and they do it, the United States looks weak to many different audiences. So to me, there are real costs. I would add there are also costs to Israel. If you look at recent polling, there has been a huge shift in support for Israel in the United States, where it's much more skewed by political party, where support used to be Democrats and Republicans largely agreed on this issue. Now it's much more Republicans are strongly in favor of U.S. support for Israel. And it's also skewed by demographics, by age. So younger people are far less supportive of Israel than older people. And it's the height of a war that could change when things calm down. But this may be a more permanent shift, and that will have long-term implications for the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Now, one thing that came out of the questions was, and forgive me, we're not going to get to all the questions in our 30-minute response, but I'm summarizing, what we can review from the questions here. But it's about Iran's nuclear capacity, the extent to which that is going to play into, the wider risks in this conflict, the incentive that Israel might have to strike at the nuclear capacity, and what we have heard is Biden's statement that he does not support such a view. Where do you sort of see that going, and how Iran's nuclear capacity fits into this wider story?
So the most important security issue for Israel over the last 25 years has been the Iranian nuclear program. And they've at times vehemently disagreed with the United States on this issue, such as when Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke before the US Congress criticizing President Obama for negotiating with Iran. They've at times worked together, and Israel has conducted a series of covert actions in Iran, some of which involve cyber sabotage, some of which involve the assassination of Iranian missile and nuclear scientists. That's ongoing. So this has been something that has occupied the attention of Israeli leaders. And to go further, in my view, part of the reason Israeli intelligence performed poorly against Hamas on October 7th was because it was focused on Hezbollah and Iran, that a lot of the intelligence capability Israel developed against these powers came at a cost with Hamas, but it's actually really paying off for Israel in terms of its operations today. The genuine view is that Iran is fairly close to being able to produce nuclear material. It then needs to be able to build a bomb. They're not the same thing. You don't automatically have a bomb once you have the highly enriched uranium. But that this is months, perhaps even a year away, but relatively close if Iran decides to do it. But that Iran has paused its program, right? That Iran really starting with even before the nuclear deal under President Obama, but has decided not to go forward and build a bomb. And whether that's a fear of more sanctions or fear of being attacked is unclear, but it's made that decision. However, the possibility that Iran soon, and very soon, could have a nuclear weapon is what keeps Israeli military and security leaders up at night. It's definitely a possibility that this could be on the target list. And a colleague of mine put it as kind of a, while we're in the neighborhood bombing in an Iranian military base, we may as well swing by and bomb a nuclear facility. So that's definitely possible.
And if it was, what do you think the implication of that would be?
So that's really unclear. I'm not sure Iran has that many options for escalation. It might launch more missiles back. It's put a huge amount into its nuclear program. So it's obviously a priority. It might again escalate what we call horizontally through terrorism. So I think there's the possibility of escalation, but that would also apply to some of the other targets Israel might hit. It's also the nuclear program is believed at least to be better defended, and that's in part due to air defense, but also much of it's underground because they know Israel might attack it. So there's an effectiveness question. Although I would point out again that Israel has shown remarkable intelligence in its operations in Iran as well as in Lebanon. So I do think there's a real risk of escalation. There's a genuine question mark about the United States. The United States, when it comes to Hezbollah and Iran, wants Hezbollah and Iran weaker. A lot of people Israel have killed are responsible for killing Americans, whether it's in Lebanon in the 80s or supporting fighters against U.S. troops in Iraq in the 2000s. But the United States is afraid of this all-out regional war. It's something that the United States in general is a status quo power in the Middle East and doesn't want things to get worse. And, each month it seems things are getting worse.
So one thing we haven't talked about, you said earlier on in the conversation that the leverage on Israel, given that this is seen as an existential conflict, is always going to be limited when a country is facing that kind of choice. But one of the things that Benjamin Netanyahu himself said in his UN speech was obviously the kind of incentives around the normalization with Saudi Arabia, the potential, reordering, if you will, of the Middle East that potential relationship enables. Is that now really just kind of dead in the water? Where do you sort of see the possibility that the incentive of normalization, perhaps linked, of course, as the Saudis have sort of said clearly, to progress a clear pathway towards a two-state solution, America's pushing of that issue. How do you think that plays into the possibilities of the incentive structure for a resolution of this crisis?
So this has been on the table for a while, right? The hope that initial American hopes were Israel hits Hamas hard, but then uses this as an opportunity to say, we're bringing the Palestinian Authority back in Gaza. They'll be the representative of the Palestinian people. We'll have a true peace that is supported by Arab states and keeps Hamas down and brings in countries like Saudi Arabia, which then have more incentive to make peace with Israel. Israel has rejected a role for the Palestinian Authority. And Saudi Arabia has said that it's not going to go forward with Israel as long as there is no progress on the Palestinian issues. There needs to be, it has said, a Palestinian state, but let's treat that as significant progress on the Palestinian side. So right now we're much farther from that than we were before October 7th, but also there were very high hopes on this. And unfortunately, they're highly unlikely to pan out. And I'll say, just to talk, with 1 second on the two-state solution, arguably that's been dead for 15, 20 years. But the October 7th really was, if the coffin needed one more nail, that was it, right? It convinced many Israelis that you could not trust the Palestinians, right? That this was a community that was incredibly hostile to Israel. And obviously Palestinians would point to 100 different what they feel are Israeli violations or abuses, but the Israeli narrative is that this is a community that cannot be trusted. Peace is, whenever Israel gives up land, it leads to violence against Israel. And therefore, you do not want to go down this road. And there's no one in Israel who's a mainstream candidate who's talking about the two-state solution. There isn't a pro-peace movement in Israel that has significant support.
Well, then we have to end with the most important question about the end game on this, given that what you just said about the possibilities in Israel, Israel's acceptance of the possibilities of a two-state solution, given what you said on the normalization parameters, given what you said earlier about the short-term victories that Israel may seem in achieving its objectives in southern Lebanon or in Gaza, but still facing sort of significant risks in the longer term. Is there an end game to this? What's Byman's end game to this?
Yeah, so something that always strikes me when I talk to Israelis is their different attitude towards this question, where the United States has a very solution-oriented approach. What do we do about Iraq? What do we do about Afghanistan? When Israel is much more, how do we manage crises? So I think from an Israeli point of view, if they're able to operate in Gaza, keep Hamas weak, and suffer a limited number of casualties there, the status quo can continue for a decade. Right? It doesn't need to be solved. It just needs to be, the level of risk needs to be reduced. And so I think they would take a ceasefire in Lebanon that pushes Hezbollah back, and they would accept the effectively a failed state in Gaza situation. To me, that leads to constant low-level crises. That will lead to a constant risk of violence. The U.S. will at times be dragged in ways it doesn't anticipate. But we don't have a good option, right? I mean, one of the joys of being a professor, right, is I can tell any policymaker why what they're going to do is not going to work. But you end up, I think, with some version of the status quo, which is a fair level of conflict. I will say that Lebanon, though, the current level is not low and is going to get higher, but there is at least a possibility there that the two sides can at least have a ceasefire for a while, as was true in the past. But with Gaza, I don't see a longer-term solution that's going to bring about good conditions for the Palestinians in Gaza while still ensuring Israeli security.
But then if Israel is thinking about, this kind of low-level equilibrium, this status quo, then escalation in Iran would be probably one of the greatest risks to that. So, keeping the engagement with Iran, at a lower level and not bumping it up via, attacks on nuclear policy. Someone mentioned, and even the possibility of attack on Iranian leadership. That if the status quo might be the ultimate objective, then I think what you're ultimately worried about is a significant escalation with Iran, and that might keep the incentive to keep that engagement at least at a lower boil.
So I would agree with that on Iran. I would agree with that on Hezbollah. I think Israelis would not agree with me. I think they would say, look, we lost deterrence on October 7th. Hamas hit us hard, and everyone knows it. And the only way we're going to restore it is if we show the Iranians, we show Hezbollah that if they try to hit us, they're going to fail. And when they do, we're going to hit them back 10 times harder. And how do you get to stability? Is you show the other side that they're going to suffer tremendously if they mess with you. And whether or not that's actually accurate, I tend to be skeptical of that narrative, but I think that's a very strong approach in Israel right now.
And what we've seen in the last sort of several weeks is, certainly a feeling that the tide has turned somewhat with Israel, with the strike in Lebanon, the pager incident, the apparent strength of Israeli intelligence. Is that feeding a view in Israel? And there were several questions have been asked about local domestic opinion in Israel and the politics in Israel and the strength of Netanyahu as a result, because we know he had been weakened by, obviously, the response to October 7th. But does this put him on a stronger footing and put Israeli public opinion on a stronger footing to, kind of push for greater escalation?
Yes, but what I want to stress is escalation works until it doesn't. Right. So if you did a measurement of Israeli losses and Hezbollah losses in the last 3 weeks, it would be a huge win for Israel. But maybe that won't be true in 3 weeks. Right. Israel has a history in Lebanon of going in, being very effective, and then getting trapped in what Israelis call the Lebanese mud. So I do think that Israel may have scored some significant victories, right? But at the same time, they're rolling the dice again and again. And perhaps it's going to work, but it's very high risk.
Well, of course, there are many questions with a group of SFS alumni. There's nothing less that you would expect. We wanted to keep this to a half hour, a few minutes over, and I appreciate the patience, but we wanted to get those last questions in and some of your last questions in. Sorry, we couldn't get to all of them, but we hope to continue to engage with you, our SFS alumni community, and our best professors and alums, to be talking fast break right after, right in the middle of a crisis, to get your engagement, to hear from our most interesting and most engaged professors, and to keep the relationship going. So thank you all for being part of the conversation. Thank you, Dan, for spending some time with us and for your insights into this. And we hope to see you again, unfortunately, probably in the midst of crisis, but nevertheless one in which we do what we always do at SFS, which is try to understand them better as a platform for better thinking of solutions to how to deal with them. So thank you very much. Good to see you all. And thank you, Dan. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.